Okay, so now let's talk about financing. Now, you mentioned earlier that for every $1 spent in early child development, the gains, it results in $8 worth of gains because they learn better, as they get employed, they earn more. No? So what's it like in terms of the sector and what's getting paid for and what's not getting paid for? There's street children. Is there enough money that allows us to help the street children move up and get back in school and stuff? Um, so, so what's it like? Is there enough money being injected in the right interventions?
Um, there's never enough money.
Yeah, I mean, in a big country or a small country.
Yeah. No, in fact, I don't have the hard figures off the top of my head, but it really also depends. It really also depends on who the funders are or the providers are, and everybody has their own baby or favorites. So, for example, down the street, ADB. And other financial institutions like World Bank and even banks that have a CSR arm, they prefer funding youth programs, and especially youth employment, entrepreneurship, and economic empowerment programs. Because of course, with the youth, the effect is much more immediate. And there is a concern with trying to, of course, mobilize the labor force as much as possible, bring down unemployment rates. With literacy, for example, or basic education, most of the people funding that would be multilaterals. USAID, DFAT from
because the gains
Australia.
will be reaped, 10 years after the
Right.
intervention or so?
And because
10,
it's
15
a
years.
government-to-government relationship, so it's kind of like U.S. wanting the Department of Education or Ministry of Education to kind of strengthen itself so that the government, the human capital becomes much more strengthened and empowered in the long run. Early childhood is actually the orphan in a way. Very few
in terms of program funding.
in terms of program funding, very few people, or I mean, it's not as well funded, or you don't have champions of early childhood as much as the other age groups. Also because the greens for that is much more long term, and you don't really see the impact as easy as you can. And at that age, you can't really assess them. You can, but we don't want to. You don't really want to assess each and every 5-year-old. Not like, for example, if it's a literacy program, there's a standardized test that people can take.
Now, this is part of a series on social impact bonds where financial instruments are developed in order to finance interventions early, upfront. And these bonds are designed to generate both financial returns and social returns 3 or 5 years down the road. So the runway is not that long, 3 to 5 years. What are your thoughts on that? Now, these financing instruments have gained credibility in more developed countries, but in the Philippines, what are your thoughts on launching something like that? Most people haven't even heard of it.
Yeah, I think it's a very exciting possibility to happen, because if the runway is 3 to 5 years, definitely we can see impact in 3 to 5 years. In fact, we can see impact in some of these programs even after 1 year.
Oh yeah?
Especially if you have a control group. It all depends on how you do your monitoring and evaluation, of course. But education, it's a public good. It should be everybody's business to want our citizenship to be much more educated than it is right now. So, and there's so much of a dearth and so much of a need and so many ways that you can support it. Like, say, if you want to focus on early childhood, you can focus on helping the ECD centers or the parenting programs, or I'm not a big fan of just kind of giving materials, but that's another way. For literacy, it's the same thing. Like, if you want to help support the development of teacher training or even parent training, and now that the Philippines, for example, introduced the mother tongue-based language of instruction or education, we have a big gap between the policy and the number of materials and storybooks and reading materials that are actually available in the many 100+ languages that we have.
So you're saying that if we invested in interventions in the education space, the educational gains can be measurable within 1 to 3 years.
Yeah.
And there's this, how would that be done? Randomized controlled trials, or
Right.
what methods are used?
Well, no, so if you want to measure gains within 1 year, then the best way, at least in our experience, we've done it through a random control trial. Because say you start the intervention, you measure them at grade 1. When they reach grade 2, you measure an intervention group and a control group. So you'll be able to see the impact of who fared better. But if we don't have a control group, because a random control trial is expensive, then that's a 3 or 5 year exercise. So we measure grade 3 right now, see what their reading assessment scores look like, and then after 3 or 5 years, you measure a different cohort of grade 3 students and see how did their reading scores fare. And in theory, they should have been improved. And that's your impact in a way.
Okay.
With early childhood, it's a little bit trickier because of, as I said, the 3 to 5 year olds, you don't want to kind of start testing them and kind of give them that stress. But the evidence is stronger that at that intervention, if you improve the learning environment, if you improve the early childhood center, if you improve and promote positive parenting, then it's automatic that the child will thrive and develop well.
So, how do you measure that?
In that sense, we will then measure the learning environment and improvements in the learning environment of the ECD center and the behavior and attitudes of the parents. So, for example, in the ECD center, you have a monitoring checklist. You go there, and then there's the physical things. Like, is it a safe space? Does it have all the materials appropriate? But then you also kind of, there's a Likert scale or grading score in which you also kind of measure or grade, I suppose, the teacher and the kind of interaction that they have. Now, of course, people will be able to say that, well, of course, they're going to perform better.
Posturing.
Because there's somebody monitoring. So on some cases, it really is a tricky thing then. If you want to do it as this big evaluation visit, or you just have a regular monitoring visit done by their own local supervisors and get the data from that, where it's much more of a natural environment.
So those are monitoring the parang inputs or the environment. How do you measure that the kid is thriving?
Yeah. No, so that's what I was saying. That we can measure that the kid was thriving because there are child level assessments to be done. And it's almost like games. So it can be as simple as I'm here with a 4-year-old and I'll say, okay, I'll show you a picture. What's happening in the picture? Is she sad? Is she happy? And then based on those answers, you measure emotional management. You can also ask them to kind of, can you walk this line? And then you're measuring psychomotor abilities.
So there's science behind
There
this?
is science. There are very rigorous child-level assessments being developed already. But we do not recommend it to be done all the time because at this age, when you do a test like that, there's a danger of labeling them as delayed. And if you're not a trained child development specialist or a psychologist, then the potential for harm is very big.
Harming the kid.
Because especially with parents of young children, it's so easy to get paranoid at that age group because when you say, they're delayed in language and literacy, and then it's like, oh my God, my child is delayed. The potential for harm is quite bigger.
So a more professional person would be more discreet, but be also more sensitive to real delays requiring
exactly
real interventions.
But then you get that kind of professional anyway when you're really concerned that the child may have delays. But for our purposes, which is more of a social impact bond, where you just want to see the general program improvements, you want you wouldn't need that kind of
high-level
professionals. So that's why we're saying it is possible to do child-level assessments, but we do not recommend it because the harm that can be done is much more. And as a child-focused organization, we want to avoid that. So as a proxy, we measure the environment instead.
Okay.
And there are indicators to say percentage of ECD centers that met quality standards, and then percentage of the parents that are displaying positive parenting practices. And that's already a good proxy because the evidence is strong to say that if you build that, almost for sure magta-thrive ang bata. So, yun. So, pag ECD centers, titingnan mo the physical space, but also more the interaction between the teacher and the child. Is she telling an age-appropriate story in such a way, etc., etc. With the parents naman, there is a survey form that kind of asks questions about their behavior and their practices. Like, in the past week, have you read to your child? In the past week, have you sang a song? In the past, things like that.
Okay.